Just briefly, I have a PhD in family studies from Purdue University. I have 7 children. My daughter Deborah's over here. I'm a retired colonel from the Army Reserve. I saw some people shaking their heads earlier. If you have a problem with anything I say, I'm very glad to speak to it, because everything I try to say, I try to back up with research. But I want to say I don't have a problem with anybody living here. Be assured of that. I don't believe in ad hominem attacks against anyone, GLBT or otherwise, and I hope my comments aren't interpreted as attacks on anybody. If you have more current research, I'd be glad to address that. Unfortunately, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't address the legal issues here, and I don't wish to go there. But I do want to bring up several things which are important in terms of context. First of all, I think you need to understand the context that we have within social science. Social science is not a value-neutral phenomenon. In this area, I have evidence that the biases in favor of the GLBT approach are very clear. There's examples of journals that are on a regular basis are derided because they're willing to publish articles that are pro and con on these sides. And I have evidence that these journals are in fact just as credible as any others. There's a tendency in social science to cite research that's in favor of gay rights but not in others. I have a published article here which indicates that there were some studies done back in 1980 by the same authors, the same journal, in the same institution. One of those papers had derogatory information about lesbian parents. The others had positive. It was the same lesbian research subjects. The article with the negative information was cited twice since then and never since 1993. The other articles are cited 65 times. That is statistically significant. So I think there's a bias here because both sides of the issue don't get treated equally. Now, that doesn't mean one side's right or one side's wrong. I'm just saying that there's a bias there. Now, you have to read the scientific literature very carefully. I have a paper here which is an assessment of 10 specific journal articles in major journals that have been published since the year 2001. The research methods in these journals violate the procedures recommended by the American Psychological Association. Specifically, they do not give effect sizes, they don't control for significant demographic variables, and they don't control for social desirability. So they don't even follow the rules that the APA recommends that people follow. And I've laid them out very specifically for each paper. Now, another piece of research I did, I looked at 51 reviews of the literature which were done in the area of gay parenting. And I assessed the quality of the dissertations that were reviewed here. The worse the quality of the dissertation, the more likely it was to be cited in the research, which I have proven in this published paper. And again, it's all very subject, if you want to criticize me or something, this is all empirical. Now, one of those papers I handed out had some research which never saw the light of day until 2 years ago, even though it was done in 1997. Everybody complains that there's no research on gay fathers, for example. Well, there was a study that had the daughters of 68 gay fathers and the daughters of 68 heterosexual fathers. That's a fantastic study. People would die to have that research published, but it didn't get published until very recently. Well, why was it? Well, it's because I think they said that the daughters of gay fathers, 34% of them abused drugs. 34% of them had a non-heterosexual sexual orientation, compared to 3% for the other groups. A majority of these women of gay fathers had a very difficult time establishing close, loving relationships. Now, we hear a lot said about love here, but that research indicated some serious issues. And that research has been published in 2009 in the Archives of Psychiatric Nursing. Now, there's concerns here about suicide, and I think everybody's concerned about them. However, in my report here, suicide is caused by multiple factors. It's correlated with about 20 of them that I list here. Now, it's considered that that discrimination is a major cause of this. But the problem is you have to explain why is it that African Americans have suicide rates that are half the frequency of white Americans. Why is that? Are white Americans discriminated against? No. Black Americans are discriminated against. If discrimination caused people to kill themselves, why don't more black people kill themselves? They simply don't do that. Now, I have a study here, Emotional Distress Among LGBT Youth, published in Journal of Youth and Adolescence last year. And they point out that suicidal ideation among gay students in Boston, Massachusetts was running 30% versus 6% for heterosexual students. And this is indeed a concern. And they also found that there was discrimination. They found that 50% of the male LGBT students said they were discriminated against, and 25% of the female LGBT students said they were discriminated against. So there is evidence that discrimination occurs. But when they statistically ran discrimination and sexual orientation status into predicting suicide intent, the fact is that the sexual orientation remained statistically significant, but the discrimination did not. I'm not sure if this thing can show the picture of this properly. Okay. So what the research is saying is the orientation was significantly correlated with discrimination, and orientation significantly predicted suicide intent, but the discrimination-suicide relationship didn't exist. It was not insignificant. So it's very difficult to make a case that it's the discrimination which is causing the psychological issues. Now, this is controversial. You probably find a paper that disagrees with it. Now, another issue I want to bring up is a stability issue, that we are concerned about children. Well, that's an important concern. One of the things that we found over time is that children have a difficult time if they have transitory relationships. And the fact is, and I have the evidence here in this paper, there's very little relationship on gay parents in terms of stability, gay fathers. So we just don't know. But in terms of lesbian mothers, there's considerable evidence that they have an instability rate that is 2 or 3 times higher than heterosexual parents. Now, this is very unusual because if you just take heterosexual people without kids and gay and lesbian people without kids, the stability rates are about the same. But if you look at people that have children, the stability rates are much greater. Nanette Gartrell published a paper recently where she admits that in her study of 78 lesbian couples, that 56% of them broke up after 17 years. Now, people will come back and say, well, isn't the divorce rate 50%? So no big deal. The problem is that the lesbian mothers all have college educations. The people that have college educations that are heterosexuals, they only have a 20% breakup rate at 10 years. These couples had a 45%. If you go to the sisters of these couples, their biological sisters only had a 30% breakup rate, as opposed to 45%. So however you slice it, the comparisons of using the 50% really don't cut it. Now, in social science, for years, people have sworn in court, gay parents don't tend to have gay children. But I have a study coming out published in the prestigious Journal of Biosocial Science out of Cambridge University. I carefully investigated that, and that is not the case. Gay parents do tend to have gay children. And in some cases, it's as high as 60% for daughters of lesbian mothers. Now, to be fair, it's 15% for sons of gay fathers. So this contradicts. What I'm trying to say is you've heard a lot of things, and you'll have a lot of people come in here and say stuff, but you've got to make sure it's correct. And believe me, I've been discriminated against for being heterosexual in making these cases. And if I told you, I already was told that I could sue somebody really good because of how I was treated as a heterosexual. But the point is, I make sure I'm right about these things because I know I'm going to have to defend them. So I'm very careful to only say exactly what I can defend. Now, the rest of this paper, I have just dozens and dozens of references which show that there's elevated rates of drug use, suicide, suicidal intention, a whole bunch of issues associated with sexual orientation. Now, more specifically, I have a paper that looks at youth. This came out of a free speech case out of Chicago. And if you're going to institute an ordinance, you want to make sure that the thing works. And so this is the standard model that is used to support an ordinance like this. If you can put the screen on. Okay, here you have sexual orientation, you have being bullied, then you have internalized homophobia or stress, and then you have adverse outcomes. Now, what I did in this rather lengthy paper was I took each one of those links and investigated it scientifically to see if it would hold up. And it's kind of like Swiss cheese. There's some evidence for some parts of it, but there's a lot of evidence that doesn't support it. And so you're free to read through this and see what I had to say there. Now, I do want to address a couple concerns. One is there's a terrible ambiguity about the definition of sexual orientation. Is it attraction? Is it behavior? Or is it identity? Every piece of research is clear. These are not synonymous terms. Some people are attracted, but they don't engage in the behavior. Some people have the identity and don't even engage in any behavior with men or women. It's a very slippery definition. And some people are out and some people are not out. So it's very difficult to know who is what, and even if they said they were something, you wouldn't know what it meant because the definitions are so complicated. At the trial in Florida, the ACLU wanted to nail me, and I knew they'd try to get me to say that homosexuality is immoral. And I don't want to go there because it's so complicated, it's almost inevitable you'll say something's immoral, which really isn't. So they said, what do you think? And I said, well, I think I've got 11 different ways people should have better relationships, and you've got 3 different definitions of this, and that's 2 to the 14th power. I said, you tell me which of the 66,536 combinations you want me to consider, and I might tell you if I think it's immoral or not, because it's a very complicated situation. Now, another thing about the mutability, it's more true for women than it is for men, but people change their sexual orientation, I don't want to say all the time, but the research is very clear. I've got papers in the box over here that show this, that people could be a lesbian 1 year, and 2 years later, they're bisexual. And 2 years after that, they're heterosexual. And some people are heterosexuals, and then they switch to being gay or lesbian. This stuff flips around from 1 year to another. Gartrell's study of the 7 to 8 lesbian couples, she hasn't told me what, I asked her, but she wouldn't tell me what the current status is, but after 10 years, I think it was, maybe even 5 years, 2 of her 78 subjects had partnered with men, and 1 subject was converting from a woman to a man. I don't know if she did the whole thing or not. So even within her study, it's complicated because the sexuality definitions are changing. And most people like to think it's immutable. People probably feel that way, but I have at least 24 studies that show that there's a significant relationship between sexual abuse as a child and having a gay or lesbian sexual orientation later on. Now, you're not going to find that if you Google it. You're going to have to come to me and ask for the paper. But there's a lot of evidence out there that it happens early enough that people pretty much feel that they are always that way. So I don't want to blame people for problems that occurred because they got abused. I really don't. But to say that it's immutable really is sort of stretching the truth. I don't argue that's how you may feel about it, but that's really not what the science has to say. You know, some people have said you should do a survey. Well, I have a copy of a survey here done in Boulder County, Colorado for 17 high schools, and they actually studied how much discrimination was going on and what effect this had, and they actually have the questionnaire that was used there. So it'd actually be fairly easy in some respects to do a study here to actually see what's going on, at least with the youth in the community, so you could actually have an assessment of what's actually going on out there and work with some data as opposed to just, you know, arguments that people make pro and con.